Hi everyone, my name's Tim Mills. I'm here with Bill Mildenhall again, and we're from Basketball Victoria, and we're here to talk to you today about the unsportsmanlike foul. But I guess, Bill, before we start having a look at the unsportsmanlike foul in a bit more detail, I guess we should take the time to have a look at this rule because it obviously has changed quite significantly over the years from an intentional foul to an unsportsmanlike foul.
Yeah, you're right, Tim. Going back a long way, the term was in fact intentional foul, but it was changed exactly for that reason because referees didn't really possess the knowledge of what a player was actually trying to do. So we had to change the terminology from intentional, and they introduced the term unsportsmanlike foul. And then they gave some clear directions really as to what contact was to be deemed as unsportsmanlike. And there were four major principal areas that referees were to judge the contact to determine whether it was an unsportsmanlike foul. And over time, I guess referees have been encouraged to even consider upgrading their calls from a normal foul when they first observe the call, and then to upgrade it with the assistance maybe of their fellow referee as well, so that the decisions were made accurately.
Thanks for that, Bill. I mean, obviously when it comes to refereeing, referees have to referee to a criteria when they're applying the rules. Could you talk to us a little bit more about criteria and perhaps give us some basic examples around this?
Thanks, Tim. I mean, with the continued evolution of the game, referees around the world have been encouraged to become more familiar and utilise more familiar terms that are consistent and can be clearly understood by all involved in the game. So now, rather than refer to the unsportsmanlike foul with its principles, they refer to the unsportsmanlike fouls with its criteria. And now there were originally 4 criteria, now it has been increased to be 5 criteria. So when referees are now deciding on unsportsmanlike fouls, they may consider which of the criteria this foul shall come under, and then if they're challenged or asked, they're then able to refer to it as the C1, the C2, the C3, the C4, or even the C5. So it's tried to make common terminology amongst all involved in the game.
Thanks for that, Bill. Before we sort of look at some clips around the unsportsmanlike foul, and now that we've got a good understanding of what the criteria is all about, can you talk to us about the 5 key criteria that underpin the unsportsmanlike foul?
Sure, Tim. The first one, the C1, is not a legitimate attempt to play the ball within the spirit and the intent of the rule. C2 is excessive hard contact caused by a player in an effort to play the ball or an opponent. C3 is the new one, which is any unnecessary contact caused by a defensive player in order to stop the progress of the offensive team in transition. This applies until the offensive player begins his act of shooting. C4 is the contact by the defensive player from behind or laterally on an opponent in an attempt to stop the fast break, and there is no defensive player between the offensive player and the opponent's basket. This applies until the offensive player begins his act of shooting. C5 is the contact by the defensive player on an opponent on the court during the last 2 minutes in the 4th period and any extra period when the ball is out of bounds for a throw-in and still in the hands of the official or at the disposal of the player taking the throw-in.
Thanks for that, Bill. Obviously a lot to take in across the 5 different criteria of an unsportsmanlike foul. But now's a good time to have a look at some of the clips that FIBA have sent through to us and have a look at some examples. So let's have a look at the C1 example first. And in this example, we're looking at play that's not a legitimate attempt to play the ball directly within the spirit of the rules.
Yes, Tim, this one initially you don't see the contact. However, when we look again in the slow-mo, that you can actually see the red girl is on the break and the blue and white girl grabs her by the singlet, and that would be regarded as not being a legitimate attempt to play at the ball, and therefore that automatically be an unsportsmanlike foul.
So it'd be fair to say, Bill, that any grab of the jersey like that by the defender is pretty much going to be automatic unsportsmanlike foul because no legitimate attempt to play the ball.
Particularly in that situation where she clearly intentionally grabbed the singlet. But you're right, Tim. In normal circumstances, if somebody grabs the singlet or the shorts, it's making a non-legitimate attempt to play the ball. But I guess, Tim, we can't say that every time someone grabs a singlet or shorts it is an unsportsmanlike foul, because there are occasions when it may occur by accident where the players get tangled up. In this example, though, it's clear that the player has intentionally grabbed the singlet, and that's not a legitimate attempt to play the ball.
Thanks, Bill. The next one is an interesting clip because the offensive player here grabs the ball and there's contact with the elbow. So the C1 criteria also applies to the offensive player as well.
Correct, Tim. I mean, this is, I guess, regarded as being within the spirit and the intent of the rule to throw an elbow and to make contact with someone that is not within the spirit and intent of the rules, and therefore that would be classified as a C1 unsportsmanlike foul.
Bill, later we're going to talk about C3, which is unnecessary contact in transition. There's contact on this one, but this comes under C1 because there is a grab and a hold of the offensive player on transition.
Correct, Tim. I guess this is, again, not a real legitimate attempt to play the ball. And it's, I mean, some people would classify that as being a professional foul, where they really weren't playing appropriate defence or within the spirit of the rule, but they just wanted to hold up the play. And the intent of the unsportsmanlike rules, and particularly the additional criteria now, is to eliminate that sort of professional foul that becomes sort of somewhat ugly at different stages of the game.
The next example, Bill, is in the dying seconds of the game, and the defensive team have to foul to stop the clock, and this obviously will come under C1 as well.
Yeah, Tim, again, this is just not a legitimate attempt to play the ball within the spirit and intent of the rule. Mind you, if the same thing was to occur in the first minute of the game, referees are encouraged to ensure that they maintain consistency and call the fouls exactly the same way.
I mean, it's going to be a significant change to all players, particularly so used to fouling towards the end of the game to stop the clock. But really, examples like this one, fouling to stop the clock without any legitimate attempt to play the ball is going to be called an unsportsmanlike foul C1.
Correct, Tim. Clearly the white player here just ignores the ball, and they're really not making an attempt to play the ball, and as a consequence it would be classified as a C1, and that would be an unsportsmanlike foul.
As we move along to C2, we look at excessive hard contact caused by the player in an effort to play the ball. These next few examples are very much excessive contact, and this one here, just hard contact on the way to the basket.
Even though you may say that the player is making a legitimate attempt to play the ball, what the referees now have to adjudicate is whether the contact is excessive and whether it's hard contact, and that's to be regarded as being an unsportsmanlike foul.
Bill, you make a good point about referees and being able to assess and adjudicate, I guess, hard and excessive contact, but what tips can you give referees about making this adjudication?
I guess, Tim, this is somewhat difficult to explain or interpret because we would all look at things a little differently. I guess the key we continue to emphasise to referees is to judge the action and the result of the action, but not the intent. If the actual contact is unwarranted or not appropriate, it must be considered then as being an unsportsmanlike foul.
This is a good opportunity, Bill, to have a look at the next clip and have a look at how the C2 is applied. And in this example here, goes baseline, there's some heavy contact there. Just want to walk us through this clip and how the referees and how you would assess this one as a C2.
It's a good example, Tim, of the offensive player actually faking and getting the defender in the air. He is committed to sort of coming down and fouling him. Where it becomes unsportsmanlike is the fact that when he brings his left arm down, that is a fairly hard and inappropriate action with his arm, and as a consequence would be classified as being an unsportsmanlike foul under C2.
As we move along to the next example, Bill, this one involves Andrew Bogut, and there is quite a fair bit of heavy contact in this one, and actually not just heavy contact, but actually the offensive player gets thumped on this play. Besides this C2 unsportsmanlike foul, we're obviously also heading towards or starting to look at some disqualifying foul stuff, but where's the fine line between an unsportsmanlike foul and disqualifying foul?
I guess it really comes down to, this is another example where the defender is probably committed to actually has jumped in the air and really doesn't have anywhere else to land. However, his actions with his arm in being excessive and being quite hard, then referees then have to make up the decision as to whether it's unsportsmanlike, well, or whether in fact it was so significant that it required a player to be disqualified.
As we move along to C3, Bill, this is where it's unnecessary contact caused by a defensive player in order to stop the progress of the offensive team in transition. This, I believe, is going to be one of the biggest changes that we're going to see to the unsportsmanlike foul. And a lot of teams obviously use it to try and stop transition when they don't have enough players back on defence. And as you'll see in this example here, offensive team trying to push the ball and there's a foul right there. So perhaps just talk to us a little bit about the unnecessary contact in transition, because as I said, this is going to be a fairly significant change to how the game is being played.
Yes, Tim, this is, as you say, is going to be controversial, I think. It's not greatly different from criteria 1 in terms of a legitimate attempt to play the ball. However, what we're saying here is if the contact is unnecessary and it's in the transition when the team lose possession of the ball and they're on their way towards the basket, irrespective of whether there are any defensive players between them and the basket, it is to be classified as an unsportsmanlike foul if the contact is regarded as being unnecessary.
One of the key points, Bill, that officials need to keep in mind is not all contact in transition is actually an unsportsmanlike foul, especially when the defender is trying to gain a legal guarding position.
Tim, that's exactly right. I mean, this one's close to, in fact, nearly being a charge. However, the point they're trying to make here is I'm coming from a legal guarding position. I'm trying to defend the offensive player in transition, and I haven't done anything that was unnecessary in terms to try to stop the player. And therefore, it would be classified as a normal foul.
Okay, Bill, the next one we're going to have a look at here is there's a turnover. The defensive player is reaching in for the ball. And what could possibly be seen as unnecessary contact, the official has called a normal foul, and this is actually a correct call. Could you walk us through how this one would be interpreted?
Again, this is going to make it very difficult for referees based on the principles of the criteria that we're talking about with unsportsmanlike fouls. However, in this circumstance, if you look, the offensive player is really trying to milk the contact. The defensive player can be deemed to have been coming from, even though he's coming from the side or behind, he's still having a legitimate play at the ball, and as a consequence, this would be regarded as a normal foul.
Bill, if we just continue watching these clips in the background, I guess from a FIBA perspective, a lot of these things, we saw last time we had a look at the travel rule, where that's been relaxed a little bit more, but also these type of fouls. It seems that from a FIBA perspective, they're really trying to let the game go a little bit more and see a little bit less interruption.
I think that's right, Tim. It's intent of FIBA is to make the game more of a spectacle, and particularly like with the unsportsmanlike fouls, and those sort of fouls which were regarded as being the professional fouls or even known as the Euro foul, they're trying to eliminate that now, where teams were just intentionally stopping the game because one team was in transition and they had no way of defending them, and so the only way they could do so was to foul them. Now the intent is to actually make the game more of a spectacle and to encourage players to play good defence. It will now make teams try to get away from the professional foul by really trying to make a legitimate attempt to play at the ball.
Bill, it's moving along to C4, and a lot of participants will be very familiar with this rule. It's a C4 rule, and it talks about illegal contact by the defensive player from behind or laterally on an opponent in attempt to stop a fast break, and there is no defensive player between the offensive player and the opponent's basket. This applies until the offensive player begins his or her act of shooting. On this play, Bill, here, Australia are able to force a turnover, and this is where the C4 rule will obviously apply.
Yes, Tim. The defensive player is coming from the side or from behind, and there is no defensive player, offensive players between them and the basket, and as a consequence, that is automatically an unsportsmanlike foul.
Just as we watch these clips, Bill, I mean, a lot of different criteria could be applied just to one play or one contact, I guess. So, you know, C1, C2, C3 or C4. So what tips can you give to referees, I guess, on which criteria to apply?
Tim, at the end of the day, I don't think it's so significant that they actually get the criteria correct, as long as they get the call correct. So if they're making the judgments on whether it's a C1 or a C2 or a C3, or even in these examples, as in a drive to the basket, there's a C4. The most important thing is you get the call correct, and then you utilise the various principles of the criteria to make that decision. With the application of the C4 criteria, referees must remember that they apply the rule until the player is in the act of shooting. Now, in this example, the player was in fact still dribbling the ball, and the contact occurred from behind, and there was no defensive player between them and the basket. That would be classified as an unsportsmanlike foul. However, if the player had have gathered the ball and was in the act of shooting, then the decision of the referee would then be to be a shooting foul and not an unsportsmanlike foul. In fact, the next clip is an example of the Australian player driving to the basket, the defender coming from the side. However, the offensive player has gained control of the ball and is in the act of shooting, and as a consequence, the foul would be a shooting foul and not an unsportsmanlike foul.
Bill, C5 is the last criteria that we're going to talk about, and it's actually criteria that many participants may have experienced over the years, and I guess we'll just take the time to explain a little bit further. But C5 is contact by the defensive player on the opponent on the playing court during the last 2 minutes in the fourth period and in each extra period, when the ball is out of bounds for a throw-in and still in the hands of the official, or at the disposal of the player taking the throw-in. In this example here, Bill, it's another classic case of playing catch-up basketball. There's around about 30 seconds to go. The red team need to score and then obviously need to foul, but they've actually fouled before the ball comes into play. So this is where the C5 criteria will apply.
As you point out, Tim, this is a good example of an unsportsmanlike foul. The offensive team have possession of the ball on the baseline, and the defensive players have now fouled prior to the ball coming into play, and as a consequence, that's an automatic unsportsmanlike foul. This is a good example where an official can use some preventative officiating by warning the teams to wait till the ball has actually been passed in before they actually make contact.
Thanks for that, Bill, and thanks for taking the time to walk through the unsportsmanlike foul today. There's certainly a lot to take on board. Similar to the travel rule, it's going to take some time. It's also a transition period for players, coaches, and also referees. And obviously will take time to implement. On behalf of myself and Bill Millenhall, thank you for watching and look forward to catching up with you again soon. Thank you.